Thanks, everybody. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 3 o'clock briefing. Before we get started, if you were watching the Bill Gates session in this room, it will be available as a video archive later on the AAAS website. This briefing now at 3 o'clock is called Open Immigration Policies Do Not Boost Crime Rates. We have 4 speakers on our briefing today. William Pridemore, the Dean and Distinguished Professor at the University at Albany. Charis Kubrin, Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society at UC Irvine. Min Shea, Professor and Director of Graduate Studies, the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland, College Park. And Cecilia Minhevar, Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. So we'll hear a few remarks from each of our speakers, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. My name is Bill Pridemore. In addition to the titles that Megan mentioned, I'm also the American Society of Criminology's liaison to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and have been in this role for about 12 years now. So I organize a panel for us each year. So immigration, crime, and justice are at the forefront of the American imagination, driven usually by ideological discourse. This panel brings social scientific methods to bear on these challenges with quantitative and qualitative data on cities, neighborhoods, and individuals, providing an evidence-based understanding of immigration, crime, and justice in the United States. Without exaggeration, it's difficult to think of an area of scientific inquiry that's more newsworthy than the topic that's covered by our panelists. Immigration to the United States is in the news daily. Crime and justice's relationship with immigration is a central theme of that discussion. Thus, immigration, crime, and justice inhabit the public's imagination, and with 2020 being an election year, it's going to continue to be front and center in the news. The findings presented in this panel are policy relevant and bring empirical evidence to an otherwise ideological discussion. So this panel is the American Society of Criminology's contribution to this year's AAAS meeting. And our panel relates directly to this year's conference theme of Envisioning Tomorrow. Social, economic, and governing challenges generate population mobility across the globe. And ideological responses often drive how immigrants are treated. Our presenters employ innovative scientific applications to better understand immigration, crime, and justice, and provide public and policymakers with a more reasoned, evidence-based approach.
Okay, thank you. So in 2017, California did something that very few states had ever done before. It officially declared itself a sanctuary state with the passage of Senate Bill 54, otherwise known as the California Values Act. And what SB 54 did, along with sanctuary policies more generally, is it limits local officials' involvement in the enforcement of federal immigration law. And SB 54, like other sanctuary policies throughout the US, has some combination of the following policies or practices. So they have what are called don't ask policies, which limit but do not completely prohibit local officials from inquiring about an individual's immigration status. So if I'm an immigrant and I go to the police to report being victimized, I will then not be followed up with questions about my status. They include don't enforce policies, which limit but do not completely prohibit local officials from inquiring being involved in the arrest and detention of immigrants for specific immigration law violations. And then they have don't tell policies, which limit the sharing of some information with federal immigration authorities. And I should say right at the outset, SB 54 allows officers widespread discretion to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement authorities when they feel that it is necessary to do so. Now, when SB 54 passed, supporters were thrilled. They felt that this would encourage trust and communication between immigrants and local police in communities throughout California. Critics, however, were concerned crime rates would rise because policies like SB 54 would encourage undocumented immigration and undermine federal enforcement efforts. The question is, what did crime do following SB 54's implementation? And our study, the first of its kind, addresses this question. In our research, we use quasi-experimental methods to create a situation that captures California had it not enacted SB 54. And we look at crime, observed crime in 2018 in California, and compare that to what we call synthetic California, or California had it not enacted SB 54, and any gap between the two time series trends represents SB 54's impact. What our analysis found was that SB 54 had no impact on neither violent nor property crime in 2018. In other words, it was a null effect. We performed a series of robustness checks which further confirmed these findings. So these findings have implications not just for California, but for other states throughout the United States, because it turns out a lot of states are considering whether they too want to implement these policies. More broadly, though, our findings suggest that little is to be gained in terms of crime control by punishing sanctuary jurisdictions, or more broadly, by enacting restrictive, harsh, or exclusionary policies aimed at immigrants and immigration. So when it comes to crime control then, where should we aim to get the most policy bang for the buck? Now, criminological literature has a lot to offer on this, but a key conclusion from that literature is that we have to look at both sides of the policy spectrum, prevention, not just punishment. And there's lots of different prevention options that one could take, but sort of a conclusion more broadly is that we have to help alleviate the strains of things like poverty, unemployment, inequality more generally. And of course, this is no easy feat, especially given the status quo, but this is what the data demand. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here on Valentine's Day. Today's challenge for me is to use 3 minutes to summarize years of my work, and more importantly, to make sure you remember it. So I'll give it a try, and I also would like to hear your questions. The goal of my research is to provide empirical evidence that's much needed for us to understand how immigration is affecting the US. My focus is on people's decision to call the police when crime occurs. And this is important because often we find us in an awkward situation where no matter what scientists will say about immigration and crime, there are people who don't believe in it. And for example, like when research shows immigration has been reducing victimization, and some of the responses, well, you don't have good data on crime because immigrants don't call the police. And therefore, my work is to test this issue, and the data that I use is called the National Crime Victimization Survey, or the NCVS. And the data is not exactly new because the Census Bureau has been collecting the data since the 1970s. But the data we use are new in the sense that only until recently, the researchers have been using the geographic identifiers in the data. So now we can use the NCVS to better measure immigration. And for today's briefing, I would just like to emphasize 2 findings from the research. The first one, as you can see from this photo, that the context of immigration is constantly changing in the US. So how places experience immigration is different in 1970 than they were in 2010, and they are now in 2020. So what this means is my research has indicated we need to examine the context of immigration in order to understand people's decision to call the police. For example, NCVS data suggests that people from immigrant neighborhoods would have lower likelihood of calling the police only when they live in a place with a relatively short history of immigration. So in places with a long history of immigration, people's decision to call the police is not strongly affected by the level of immigrant concentration in their neighborhoods. And therefore, studying context is the first lesson to be learned. And then secondly, I'm now using the most recent NCVS data to study people's citizenship status. And the data has suggested that individual citizenship status by itself is not strongly affecting people's decisions. Instead, I'm analyzing the characteristics of the crime, and also these decisions are most likely to be affected by the context of immigrant reception. So just to conclude, I hope there are 3 things you might find useful. First, we need to be sensitive to the context of immigration when we study these issues. Second, NCVS is a very important data source that can be used in addition to police crime statistics that help us understand immigration and crime. And then lastly, knowing how people make decisions on calling the police is a key piece of the puzzle that needs additional research. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to share my research here today. I will turn to a different form of research, and my work is basically more qualitative in nature, more ethnographic qualitative, in-depth interview based. And I want to make 3 points regarding my presentation today. Central American women flee conditions of violence. I can, the first point. Second, the experiences of violence continue through the migration process, through the journey. And third, experiences of violence continue as they enter the United States, especially as they enter the immigration system and the conditions that receive them as undocumented asylum seekers. The thread that connects these three stages of the migration process is that although women flee conditions of violence in Central America today, leaving those conditions does not equate to ending experiences of violence. These continue through the journey and upon entering the United States, especially in detention facilities and as they leave detention facilities. The first stage of the migration process, leaving a context of violence, is based on my years of research in Central America, interviewing women, as well as on surveys that I have helped design, especially for the UNHCR, that has found a very high rate of women expressing concerns for conditions of violence in their decision to migrate. With regards to their experiences during the journey, I have not done field work in Mexico or during the journey, but there are enough reports and scholarly work that have documented what women go through. And there's one very recent report that just came out yesterday by Médecins Sans Frontières that largely corroborates what most other work on the migration process points to. And third, the conditions in the United States as they seek asylum and as women end in detention facilities is based on interviews with women who have been in detention in the United States, who are released on alternative to detention programs, and interviews with lawyers who are assisting women with their asylum applications. We have done 12 interviews with lawyers and 6 interviews with women who have been in detention facilities, in addition to conducting more in-depth observations with both groups. So the takeaway here is that leaving conditions of violence for Central American women seeking asylum in the United States today does not equate to ending violence in their lives. The violence continues through the journey and as they enter the United States in detention facilities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. We will now take questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic and kindly state your name and affiliation before you ask your question. So we have a question here in the back.
Hi, Robert Frederick, American Scientist Magazine. This question is for Dr. Kubrin.
Yes,
Did I say that right, I hope?
you did. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Charis.
As regards to modeling the California, I guess, crime rate, how do you do that as opposed to say, let's look at previous years? Why go forward with a model and try and model what would have happened as opposed to just looking at past data? And then how did you do that modeling?
Great question. So we actually use data going all the way back to 1970 through 2018. SB 54 was enacted in 2017, so we're looking at its impact in 2018 on crime. We use the data, what we call the pre-intervention time period data, 1970 right up to 2017, to help us create our synthetic California. So that is every other state in the United States. We take their crime data, and we find states that mimic California in its violent and property crime trends in that pre-intervention time period, but that did not enact an SB 54 style intervention. And so for the case of violent crime, we create a synthetic California. For the case of property crime, we create a synthetic California. And then we compare California and synthetic California in terms of crime in 2018. So it's kind of like what we call a pre-post analysis that allows us to determine and isolate, more importantly, the causal impact of this policy on crime. The biggest issue I've had is that a lot of people will look at what crime did following a policy and assume that the policy is the reason for that increase or decrease. Unfortunately, crime is caused by many myriad of factors that need to be controlled if you're to isolate out any one policy or thing. This approach, it's called the synthetic control group design, allows you to do just that. It allows you to isolate out this policy's unique causal impact. I hope I answered your question.
Min, you talked about some next steps in understanding people's decisions to call the police, and how it's going to be important. You've looked at that, and you want to continue to look at that. What are the next steps there, and what specific questions or insights will you be trying to gain?
Well, like a lot of times when people look at these kind of decisions, they just assume that individual level characteristics are the most important decisions that to help people decide. So for example, if you really believe in that immigrants would have a lower likelihood of calling the police, then the data would have reporting bias when you're trying to analyze the data you need to correct. But what so far the evidence actually shows that, for example, if you compare US-born citizens to naturalized citizens and then to non-citizens, and some of them may have sort of questionable legal status, you would find that whether or not they call the police is actually heavily dependent on where they live and the type of crime they're experiencing. Certain types of crimes are very sensitive for immigrant groups, but then at the same time, there are cases actually non-citizens are calling the police more frequently than the US citizens. So you really need to understand how these data are helping us generalize the crime statistics in the US, which researchers are using to analyze the relationship between immigration and the crime. I think from my research, the most important lesson is you cannot isolate that just to say, use a very simple assumption that immigrants don't call the police, and therefore to make that sort of like very simple assumption. Instead, you need to consider specific types of crime and specific local policies to understand why they may or may not have higher or lower likelihood of calling the police.
What are some of the crime types where non-citizens are more likely to call?
Well, a lot of times, like if you have robberies, very serious types of instances, non-citizens actually are not very shy in terms of calling the police. But things like rape and sexual assault, it's culturally very difficult for them to talk about it. Those are the crimes that you might see the lower likelihood of reporting.
Question in the back.
Hi, my name is Chris Barnard. I'm a science writer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I see very little discussion of research when there's a public conversation about immigration and immigration law, and I wondered if anybody could weigh in on why there's not a lot of public presentation of this research in these debates, and whether the field is terribly mature yet on immigrants and crime.
Oh, that's not the reason. Sorry, I'm just going to jump in on that. In fact, so my main area of research looks at the immigration-crime relationship, mainly across place. And I've been investigating this for 15 years, as have many others in the field. And probably one of the most consistent, there's really two consistent findings in that literature. At the individual level, immigrants are less likely to offend compared to their native-born counterparts. And secondly, across place, immigration to an area causes crime to go down or has no impact on crime. And I was involved in a meta-analysis recently with my colleague Graham Owsey, where we looked at over 50 studies, over 550 findings, and were able to conclude across this body of literature that across place, basically, immigration is not associated with crime. So we actually, as far as I'm concerned, I feel like the field is done addressing the question, are immigration and crime related? I think what my colleagues here have emphasized is it's time to get down into the weeds and the nuts and bolts, whether it's context, whether it's specific groups, and really start to investigate what some of the issues are beyond that generic question. I don't know that I have a great answer, and I'm going to turn it over to them in terms of why that message, why what we know in the data is not reaching public perception and certainly not necessarily reflected in our policies. We could probably go on and on for that about days, but I'll turn it over to you all to say your thoughts on that.
I think there's much more attention on the association between immigration and crime persists regardless of the research, as Charis has just said. But on the other hand, we also have a panoply of laws and policies that contribute to expand the categories of crime for which immigrants can be charged and placed at risk of detention. And so on the one hand, you have a process of criminalization of immigrants by which immigrants who have committed no crimes that we understand as crimes are being wrapped into the criminal justice system. And on the other hand, we have the research that proves the opposite.
Well, if I may add, there are studies published evaluating policies such as 2A7G, secure communities. A lot of these issues would suggest that maybe the relationship between policies and crime are not that strong, or some may have some harmful effects on local communities. I guess the key question sometimes is the government does listen. For example, like the suspension of the 2A7G task force model was due to largely because of finding of a lot of violation of civil rights, for example. But at the same time, a lot of times how much social scientists can talk to policymakers may be limited just because the lawmaking may go through a different process. So of course, as scientists, we want to provide as much empirical evidence as we can. And we're also working really hard to try to talk to policymakers and share our findings. But at the same time, it is true that the evidence is not sufficient enough to sometimes to talk about the policy's impact. That's why I think Charis' study about how these state policies can affect local conditions is very important. It's just how do we enhance the communication between scientist evidence and then the policy making in the field.
If I may, just very quickly, the question that you asked is not unique to immigration and crime. What criminologists and those who study crime and justice look at, many of the topics that we address are in the public imagination, in the public eye, and are addressed by our nation's politicians. So I think the answer, a brief answer to the question more generally, is that science and advocacy are two very, very different things. And while there are wonderful scholars in criminology and sociology, psychology related areas studying these issues, that information, they are not in front of television cameras and running for office and looking for sound bites. They're in the background doing the wonderful work, while those who are advocating or who are taking ideological approaches often do not pull upon, draw from that work. So it's nothing unique to immigration, crime, and justice at all. It's very similar across the items that we address in our field.
Question here.
Hi. This seems like an extremely important question. So as an extension of that and of what you all just said, what advice do you have for your fellow academics who come up with research findings that look extremely important to the public, where the political mechanisms are working hard to pretend they ignore what you've done, and the tradition in academia is you just shake your head and say there's not much we can do? Is there something that all of you can do that's different?
Well, I'm going to call out academia here for just a second, because I do think academics could do a lot more than we are doing. It's costly to do so, and I wouldn't certainly give this advice to a brand new assistant professor who's starting out, who needs to get tenure, to spend a lot of time publicizing the findings. But as I got tenure and then eventually became a full professor, I got convinced simply publishing my research is not enough. That is not the same thing as communicating it widely. And so I've started doing all kinds of activities post-publication that involve communicating that research far and wide, well beyond the journals that very few actually can read or even have access to, whether that's op-eds, talks, meeting with people up and down the state of California. We went to Sacramento to share these findings, that sort of thing. That is now part of the dissemination process for every single paper I do, whether it's immigration or a different topic. But it's extremely time-consuming, and we're not really trained to do that. So I've had to learn the hard way, but it's been very rewarding. And it's also forced me to get out of my academic bubble and talk with people who are making the policies or who disagree with what the research has to say, and learn from that as well. So I do think academics can play a greater role than we are playing right now.
My question was what role, how, specifically, what would you advise?
Well, everything I just mentioned. So I did a study on Prop 47 and AB 109 realignment in California. These are criminal justice reforms. I made sure to meet with every single person up in Sacramento who was interested in these policies. We met with local law enforcement teams to share the findings. At UC Irvine, I teach a class on immigration, primarily to share the facts with the students, because I think it's important at a very early age for them to be exposed to a data-driven approach so that they're not just being infiltrated, like you mentioned before, with the news and other sorts of messages about this. So I do think there's lots of things, everything from that to working with our students at our universities, but it has to be beyond simply publishing in the journals.
I don't mean to be argumentative, but it sounds to me like as a group you're saying one thing and then you're also saying the opposite. You're saying we need to do more, and then you're saying specifically we need to do more of what we've done, more going through the official channels, and you're while saying the official channels don't work when we go through them.
I don't know. Well, yeah.
I think we have a responsibility to do our research and to disseminate it. And more social scientists are doing this because we are oftentimes not called to provide our research to inform major debates. And there's so much we can do to inform policymakers, to inform different constituencies, whether it's students, journalists, the press, but that's all we can do to disseminate.
Well,
Do you have any suggestions for us?
What sorts of things are you thinking about?
Well, I hear you talk about
We get a mic, just since the question's continuing, and then we'll have one more question here and see if others may have questions. I think our mic is stuck. Could we get a mic here, Andrea? Thanks. We can take one more question right there. Right here. Thank you.
I don't want to dominate. If somebody else has a question, please.
I actually have a
But
Is there another hand up? Okay, we can come back here just to keep things moving. Thank you.
I have a clarification to make when we talk about the intersection of immigration and crime. We often think of the associations that my criminologist colleagues have been working on very hard, and as Charis mentioned, the research has produced enough evidence to clarify what this association looks like. At the same time, we have policies that have continued to create and expand categories that to categorize immigrants into those criminal categories. So for instance, just to give you one quick example, being in the country without documents is a misdemeanor. To have been deported and have returned is an act that has been reclassified as a felony. And that is a much more serious crime that carries more penalties. Re-entering the country after a deportation used to not be a felony before the 1996 immigration laws. And it is not a crime that the public would often associate with robberies, assault, rapes, and the like. So I think on the one hand, we have a process of criminalizing immigrants, and on the other hand, we have a research that shows that conceptions of common crime and immigration are not as related as we think they are.
Question in the back.
Robert Frederick, again, American Scientist Magazine. Two of you have self-described quantitative scientists, and one of you is self-described qualitative. To the extent that the conversation is about quantitative and qualitative understanding of crimes done by immigrants, I wondered if there's quantitative data about the qualitative understanding that you have of crimes done to immigrants, and whether immigration policies have changed or is in the process even of changing crimes committed against immigrants.
You want to take that one, Mel, since you do victimization? Yeah.
Sure. First of all, I tend not to trying to make it two sides pit against one another. So quantitative, qualitative. I actually think qualitative is a very useful field of study that helps us to gain inside information. And then we use quantitative data to test some of the hypotheses and further develop the theory. But there is actually a line of research showing, for example, talking about how the lack of legal status in the U.S., so in other words, unauthorized populations tend to have higher risks of victimization. So there is evidence based on field work, based on certain cities, like I believe in like Phoenix, for example, you study those issues. What I find it's challenging is because if you use a lot of those data, they are useful. At the same time, you may want to use a more representative sample just to get a better sense of the overall conditions. And so there's the discussion about how robberies against immigrants may be a particular risk because they are regarded as certain, like walking ATM, there's this argument. And also there are certain types of domestic violence could be higher just because people lack of immigrant status. Again, and also there's also policies in certain areas makes the environment can be hostile towards immigrants. So these different types of crimes could be at higher risk. But again, it's you really need to look at the conditions of the state, the local jurisdictions, and how the state provides support for immigrants to really understand exactly like to what extent that's really a large difference between the U.S. citizens and then the non-citizens.
I will add just one thing, which is that a lot of the official data that we use, for example, I use Uniform Crime Report data, which is reporting, offenses. The problem with it is that it does not disaggregate by status that allows us to answer questions, for example, whether a crime was committed by a native-born, foreign-born individual, let alone whether if foreign-born, it's documented or undocumented. So we have challenges with being able to answer some of the most fundamental questions about immigration, crime law, and victimization, largely because of challenges with data access. So this is partly why qualitative research is extremely important here to get at some of these unanswerable, I should say, questions.
And at the same time, I do primarily qualitative work and over time. And without quantitative research, I wouldn't be able to put in context my findings. So I think in this, you have an example of this kind of research where qualitative and quantitative work has to go hand in hand. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Right.
You were seeing evidence of crimes committed against
Right,
and
right.
wondered if the quantitative scientists had that data or access to that data to verify. And it doesn't sound like that data exists.
Well, NCVS have now citizenship status.
That's new.
Right.
Yeah,
very
that's
new.
very new.
So it's national-wise, there are some actually comparable crime risks, but you can see certain pockets in the United States would have that condition. Make it easy for immigrants to have victimization rates.
Charis, your study, the SB 54 study, showing the reduction of crime, an important example of a state policy affecting local conditions. When we're writing about this beyond California, are there other examples of state policies affecting local conditions showing a crime reduction that we should be communicating? Yeah.
In fact, ours is the first state level study on SB 54, but there are two previous studies that are fantastic that look at sanctuary status and crime, primarily across cities, because most sanctuary policies are city level policies, so cities elect to be sanctuary. California is one of a handful of states that said, forget cities, we're the whole state sanctuary. But two studies in 2019, and I'm happy to send you all those studies, have looked at city-level policies and their impact on crime. So what happens when a city becomes a sanctuary city? What happens to crime? One study found that there was a reduction in robbery and a null effect for homicide. So in fact, robberies went down as cities became sanctuary, no effect on homicide, and the other found also a null effect. So in the paper, we describe how we've now got 3 studies, 2 at the city level, ours at the state level, that are beginning to emerge around some sort of consensus about sanctuary status and crime. Now, this, of course, flies in the face of what's happening right now. We heard the State of the Union address where there is a lot of critiques about sanctuary status. And so I know this is a hot issue. We just have these few studies, but I sense that we're moving in some sort of direction of getting a better understanding of how sanctuary status and crime go together.
When you were doing the important and difficult work of communicating through the talks and the op-eds and everything that you described, did you get a sense that certain people listening were wrestling with the information and experiencing a change of perception about things?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the issues that we deal with, and this is what Bill was talking about, they're sensitive to people, whether it's the death penalty or, mass incarceration, what have you. And so people tend to want to personalize that. And they will say, but I know of this case or this N of one story, and that's not to minimize those experiences and personal feelings. But at the end of the day, we're hoping that policy is made not by those N of one experiences, but by what the data have to say. In the case of immigration and crime, the data are very clear on this. So policies, harsh policies aimed at immigrants and immigration really are not going to do much to change the crime problem in the United States, if we're being real about it. If we actually want crime to go down in the United States, spending time attacking sanctuary jurisdictions and or instituting harsh immigration policy is not going to get us very far. That's what the data say.
Is most of that data, is that in journals or is it open? How important is it to legislation that this data be open? Is it open? What does that look like?
Well, I'll let Min speak about NCVS, but so most of the criminologists that I know work with UCR data. That is publicly available. Anyone can download it off the FBI's webpage. We have downloaded, like I said, data going all the way back to 1970. There are a number of criminologists in the field who work with their own survey data because of the issue of reporting that was mentioned here is so fundamental to this question. So they are engaging in all kinds of self-report surveys, asking people about their reported crime events and that sort of thing, and following up by checking official records to determine issues around misreporting. And so we're starting to develop databases that allow us to better get at some of these questions, but like I said, a lot's still missing.
Yeah, the victimization survey in the U.S. actually also is publicly available. The issue is, can you get access to the geographic identifiers for which actually Census Bureau has established what they call the research data centers across the country. So multiple states would have it. Researchers, what they need to do is to submit proposals and then to the Census Bureau, then they can access the data to analyze the informations there.
In my case, my primary form of data collection are in-depth interviews and ethnographic fieldwork. But when I need to answer a particular question that will differ will lead me to another method, I have conducted surveys as well. I conducted, and I mentioned this because this one survey of immigrants on temporary protected status is the first survey of its kind in the United States, where we have over 2,000 respondents to this survey, and that allowed me to write a report and an informational sheet that then I helped to disseminate in all offices of Congress and the Senate. So that was another example of how we try to disseminate information. I have written op-eds based on my qualitative work, but I've also done that with survey in efforts to distribute this information and to hopefully make this information reach beyond academia.
If we don't have any other questions, thank you so much. That was extremely interesting. And, oh, we do. Sorry. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Yeah, all right, back to the corner. It's a good corner. Yeah.
Thanks, Robert Frederick, again, American scientist. So with this new question that's about citizenship, when will you be able to start parsing out that data and answering those other questions about immigrants committing crimes or having crimes committed against them?
Well, you will not have information about immigrants committing crimes because it's a survey on victimization. Currently, the most recent data would be in 2017, so we're hoping that they will release more recent data soon. But it's a very useful tool because that would be the best data we have in the nation about victimization risks. Well, if you're just trying to study nationwide average, 1 year data is kind of tell you a lot. But let's say, for example, if you want to know certain jurisdictions, certain states, then you really would require multiple years of data to be able to analyze data at the state level or local jurisdiction level.
But NCVS is done every 4 years? Or how
No,
many?
annually.
Oh, it's annually?
Annually.
Okay. I haven't worked with
But the thing is, it's designed to get estimations of crime for the nation. So you can say, on average, what's the victimization rates for U.S.-born citizens versus other types of citizenship. But you trying to go down to the states then becomes difficult. 2017. Right. Mm-hmm.
So in theory, you could start collecting this annually now moving forward.
Right.
Great. Thank you all so much. That was extremely interesting. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Bill, for doing that.